A new Jets season is about to begin, and optimism is high with Aaron Rodgers at quarterback. It was true last year. Things did not work out all that well. It's true this year. Things could be different, and we'll talk about why today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Happy Labor Day. It's Monday, September 2nd, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GettingGreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast for us, please give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Well, the season begins 1 week from today. Jets play Monday Night Football Week 1 against the San Francisco 49ers in just 7 days. A lot is similar heading into the 2024 season as we felt heading into 2023. Optimism is very high, but things did not work out so well in 2023. I think that there's a very good chance things are going to work out a lot better for the New York Jets in 2024, and we're going to talk about why on today's episode. And I think the number one thing you have to look to are injuries. Now, a couple things about this. Number one, I know I've been one of the people saying that, injuries are a danger for this team. And that's because of how many players the Jets are relying on to play key roles who are either at an advanced age or have an extensive injury history, or in many cases, both. And this is a risk for the Jets. But I think you also have to look at this holistically. And last year, the Jets had some unbelievably bad injury luck. And I think we all know the biggest injury they suffered last year. It was 4 plays into the season when Aaron Rodgers went down. Only the Jets could make a trade like they did a year ago for Aaron Rodgers and then lose him 4 plays into the season after an offseason of nothing but hype, after entering the season with so much optimism, and in 4 plays, it's all gone. And of course, we didn't realize it at the time. I mean, the Jets actually got off to a pretty decent start last year. You may remember that they were 3-3 through their first 6 games. They beat the Philadelphia. In fact, they were 4-3. They had a big win over the Philadelphia Eagles. They had a win over the Buffalo Bills. And it felt like maybe they could pull this thing together even without Rodgers. And then things kind of fell apart. And looking back on it, it was always going to be tough for them to be able to operate without Rodgers. Now, look, Rodgers is a risk in many areas. He is 40. He is coming off a very serious injury. And even before the injury, we had seen signs of decline. But it's undoubtable the Jets would have been a much better team with Rodgers at quarterback last year than they were with Zach Wilson. And, the other guys, Simeon and Tim Boyle. Look, we can't guarantee that Rodgers will be healthy this year. Of course, it's always possible he could get injured again. But the odds would definitely favor him playing more than 4 snaps this year. And beyond Rodgers, and just upgrading the quarterback position is key, because most of the snaps are going to be played at a much higher level this year with Rodgers. Even if Rodgers declines to a degree, even if Rodgers declines a lot, he's still going to be better than Zach Wilson. So the Jets are going to get much higher caliber snaps at the most important position on the field. But I think this goes a little bit deeper than just Rodgers, because you have to remember all the injuries the Jets suffered on the offensive line last year. They had 13 players play at least 80 snaps on the offensive line. Now, if you think about this, on the initial roster the Jets had this year, they had 10 players on the offensive line. That's actually a pretty heavy load to have on the offensive line. Usually teams don't keep 10 offensive linemen. The Jets did. 13 guys played at least 80 snaps last year. So you think about this, that's like 3 practice squad caliber players who are playing a game or 2 for your team. And beyond that, just beyond the caliber of players, you constantly have to reshuffle the line. So you can never develop any chemistry or continuity, which anybody who works with the offensive line will tell you is critical. Now, offensive line is an area where obviously there are lots of injuries. And obviously, this year the Jets are dealing with some guys who are injury prone. Tyron Smith first among them, who's also, 33 years old. Elijah Vera-Tucker trying to stay healthy for the first time, since his rookie season. Trying to play half the year for the first time since his rookie season. Morgan Moses, last year, always been a durable guy, but actually missed some time last year for the first time since his rookie season, and is 33. So there are injury risks on the offensive line. But here's the way I look at it. I think there's always this tendency to kind of misconstrue stats. There's the old saying, if you flip a coin and it lands heads, what are the odds you get tails the next time? It's 50%. The odds of getting tails are not increased. I think when you look at it from the median perspective, can you expect your typical team to have your starting quarterback play 4 snaps? No. Can you expect your typical team, even when you're dealing with guys who are risky injury-wise, even when you're dealing with those types of guys, can you expect the median team to have to play 13 offensive linemen, at least 80 snaps? And the answer to that is no. So, when we say luck's evening out, that doesn't mean the Jets are necessarily going to be the most healthy team in the league this year. It just means they're probably going to deal with injuries less than they did a year ago. Because, Rodgers could get, I don't even want to bring this up, but Rodgers could go down on the second or third play this season, and heaven help us if that happens. Yeah, I guess there's a scenario where the Jets can have that many injuries again because your starters are pretty injury prone. That was true last year, though. I mean, last year you were going with a 38-year-old who was coming off a serious injury, and Dwayne Brown at one tackle spot. You were bringing back Mekhi Becton off 2 full seasons missed. So it's not like the Jets were going with guys last year who are the models of durability. The point is that it's not reasonable to predict that this is anything like that would ever happen to a team. So it's not reasonable to predict it's going to happen a second year in a row. And we all know the offensive issues the Jets had last year, and there were many different layers to them. And I think that to some extent, the quarterback was maybe overly scrutinized because there were other issues on this offense. We're going to talk about them and what the reasons they've been fixed ahead on this episode. But it is true that the quarterback going down had a lot to do with the Jets' issues. And even if Rodgers does miss time this year, I would feel pretty comfortable taking the over that he's going to play 4 snaps. I'd feel comfortable taking the over that he's going to play, much more than 1 full game. I think if you look at Rodgers' career, and he is older now, so, the injury risk is elevated, but Rodgers has never been a guy who's missed a ton of time. So, and while I think that this injury will continue to have lingering effects, I think, his already declining mobility is probably going to be gone. I don't know that there's necessarily an enormous risk for him to re-injure himself, based on what I know. Now, if they had brought him back late last season, that would have been a different story. But the main point is that you're going to get much, much higher caliber snaps at the most important position on the field. And I think we can probably surmise that you're going to get much, much higher caliber snaps in the trenches on the offensive line, because just from the standpoint that it's unlikely that even with the guys the Jets have, even though I've been, kind of sounding the alarm about the injury risk they have on the offensive line, and they do, and it is a concern, especially if the Jets really want to compete for, an AFC crown, and they're going to need guys to stay healthy. You do kind of compare the base case scenario from last year versus this year. And this year, it's probably going to be better just from the standpoint that it's unlikely you're going to suffer this many injuries. I understand, MetLife turf. I understand, you're playing on the worst playing surface in the league, 8 times a year. I understand that, again, lots of guys who are older, maybe more injury prone than your typical offensive lineman. But even factoring all that in, you'd have to imagine the Jets are not going to have as bad of an injury luck as they did a year ago with these guys. But it wasn't all about injuries last year. I think, again, there is a tendency to maybe focus all of our attention on injuries and not on some of the other factors. And ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we're going to focus on an area that kind of flew under the radar last year, but was a major issue in the Jets' offensive struggles and how it may have been fixed this year. That's ahead here on this Monday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Gametime. Of course, the U.S. Open tennis is happening this week in New York. About a year ago, I went to the U.S. Open. Did not have a ticket. It was about an hour before the session was beginning that day, and I pulled out the Gametime app, and I found a great deal. I couldn't believe how cheaply I got in, and I had a great day watching U.S. Open tennis. Well, now you should know Gametime has a new feature called Gametime Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even easier. Gametime Picks filters out the fluff to show you incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste your time searching through thousands of tickets. Again, Gametime's an amazing app. I've used it plenty of times, including last year when I went to see U.S. Open tennis, but it's available for so much more. You want to go see the Jets next Monday night in San Francisco? Gametime's the place to go to get in on the action. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL. It's one word, no space, LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Gametime. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. What's something you'd love to learn? As an adult, do you make time to learn new things as often as you'd like? Or was that lost in childhood? Kids are always learning and growing, but as adults, sometimes we lose that curiosity. What's something you'd like to learn? Gardening, a new language, maybe how to finally beat your best friend in bowling? Therapy can help you reconnect with your sense of wonder because your back-to-school era can come at any age. And therapy has many benefits. It's helpful for learning positive coping skills and how to set boundaries. It empowers you to be the best version of yourself. It's not just for those who've experienced major trauma. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Rediscover your curiosity with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen every day. Big shout out to you, everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. For your second listen, the new Locked On NFL is here. Locked On NFL is now 2 shows every day. First, the madman Tyler Rowland kicks off your morning with a double shot of NFL espresso, and then stop by the barbershop with Tony Wiggins for some real NFL talk. Add in the Locked On local experts, and you get unprecedented NFL insight, hot opinions, daily breakdowns, all in 30 minutes. It's the new Locked On NFL, and it's twice a day. Make the madman Tyler Rowland and the barber Tony Wiggins your second listen at the new Locked On NFL on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. And today on Locked On Jets, our focus is on the season that begins a week from today in San Francisco. The Jets will be on Monday Night Football. And if it feels similar to last year, that's because there is really a similar vibe around the New York Jets. Last year, there was lots of excitement around the team as they added Aaron Rodgers. They were beginning week 1 with what was a marquee matchup. In that game, they played the Buffalo Bills, and that was the point where the season kind of went sideways because the Jets lost their starting quarterback for the entire season. This year, we're hoping to have Rodgers for more than 4 plays. I would be inclined to think that there's very good odds the Jets are going to have Rodgers for most of the season this year. I mean, it's very unusual you lose your quarterback in the first game of the season. But I think there are some other differences around the team this year. I think this year's team is better built than last year's team. You know, this time last year, there were some areas that were some really big concerns for this team. And I think among them, at the top of that list was the offensive line. And I think, to be fair, you have to say, heading into 2023, Joe Douglas and the Jets front office did an abysmal job building that offensive line, especially at the tackle position. I mean, looking back, and I can't even say it's in hindsight, because even in the moment, it felt like a really bad idea to have those 2 tackles, Dwayne Brown and Mekhi Becton. I mean, having one of those 2, maybe you could talk yourself into. That season, that team was not built to last year. And a lot of it had to do with the tackle position. And in some ways, I feel like I want to phrase this the right way, but in some ways, I feel like the Rodgers injury maybe kind of benefited Joe Douglas because it was very easy to put all of the offensive struggles on Zach Wilson. And it kind of obscured how lousy of a job the Jets did with the offensive line. Now, to be fair, as we mentioned in the first segment, they had a lot of injuries. But the thing that makes it difficult for me to absolve a front office of injuries is when your plan A was not very good. You know, I remember back in 2014, that was the famous year where John Idzik signed no corners, and it was the deepest free agent corner class in history. And the Jets entered that offseason with the second most cap space in the league. And the Jets ended up having a disaster 2014 season, in part because they had no corners who could cover. And they went into that season, and like at the time, this is very easy to forget, but people defended the job John Idzik did because they said, well, their first round pick from 2013, D. Milner, got injured. The guy that was kind of like an under the radar, they did sign one guy, Dimitri Patterson, who pretty much quit on the team in preseason. And then their third round pick, Dexter McDougal, got injured. And people were saying, well, Idzik's plan didn't work. Idzik's plan was terrible. Like I can't absolve a GM for injuries when your plan stinks. Your plan A is bad. And the Jets' plan A was bad last year. And if Rodgers had not suffered that injury against Buffalo, I think a lot of the last season would have been focused on how he was constantly getting hits, how the Jets couldn't protect him. And I think Douglas would have received a lot more criticism, and probably rightly so. I think Douglas kind of skated on the criticism because the quarterback got hurt, and it kind of camouflaged some of the other issues on offense. Because the quarterbacks, look, when your quarterback gets injured, it's a big problem. But the Jets offense had issues that were fundamentally beyond the quarterback last year. And among them were the issues on the offensive line. Now, I feel like we've been here before with Joe Douglas. So I don't want to say Joe Douglas has done a great job with the offensive line, because I feel like there have been many points in the past where Douglas has gotten flowers for something he's done in the offseason and things don't work out all that well. But I do think that this offensive line is built better. I guess last year you had to talk yourself into the offensive line. You kind of just had to convince yourself that somehow there was a way this was going to work out. Whereas this year there's a plausible path to it working out. Now we can talk about longer term issues. We can talk about the full body of work with Douglas on the offensive line. But I think and we can talk about the position the Jets put themselves in heading into this offseason, because the Jets did not put themselves in a good position. I think, to be fair, you would not want to put yourself in a spot where you have to depend on a 33-year-old Tyron Smith to hold up for the full season if you had the choice. But the Jets did not have a choice. The Jets had a very limited set of options in front of them. And I think to get Tyron Smith with only $6 million guaranteed, that was a risk worth taking, because this is still a guy who plays at a very high level when he's on the field. And of course, when he's on the field is one of the operative phrases. But there's not a lot financially lost if Smith doesn't hold up, because most of his deal is incentive based. So only $6 million guaranteed. It can get up to $20 million if he hits all of his incentives. And if he hits all of his incentives, he's a franchise. He's a guy who has a multiplier effect across the offensive line. He can make that offensive line a top-notch offensive line because he's that good. And if he doesn't pan out, it's going to impact the Jets season, but at least financially, you don't take a big hit. The trade for Morgan Moses, I thought, was a very solid move. You're kind of righting a wrong. The Jets never should have let Morgan Moses leave after the 2021 season. And maybe the biggest reason among those is that Moses seldom misses a snap. I mean, he played through a painful injury last year. He took the field at a point where he was not, he dealing with a torn pec, which the Ravens apparently wanted to shut him down, I was reading, and Moses somehow played through it. So when you talk about all the injuries the Jets have had on the offensive line, you think about what Morgan Moses would have meant to this line the last couple of years if the Jets had just been smart and kept him around. It may have changed a few things. I don't want to overstate how good Morgan Moses is, but and then we'll see how John Simpson. I think John Simpson's level of play is tied directly to how good to whether Tyron Smith's on the field. Because I think a guy like John Simpson, who's the new left guard, is going to look good if he's next to a guy like Tyron Smith. Maybe not so good if he's next to a lesser left tackle. But even beyond that, in the first round of the draft, the Jets did draft Olu Fashanu, so they've at least thought about their future on the offensive line. They now have a guy who can slide in there for Smith next year. But beyond that, Fashanu has a big role on this team this year, because with two 33-year-old tackles, and even though we know Moses has been durable through his career, he is getting up there in years and did play through that injury last year. You have a high upside player who you can plug in if there's an injury. Last year, you're pretty much an injury away, a tackle from being in big trouble, which is where the Jets ended up. So they at least have a number 3 tackle who there's a reasonable chance you can plug in and watch him play decently. You certainly hope so. So this is to say the Jets are probably going to be able to control the line of scrimmage better than they did a year ago, because they have better players up front. You have Joe Tippmann entering year 2 at the center position. For the first time, Breece Hall is actually going to have an offensive line that can block holes for him. That hasn't happened to this point in Breece's career. That's a good thing. I think an offensive line is also critical for Rodgers, because he's coming off that injury. He's not going to have the mobility he did back in his Green Bay days. Now, Rodgers was never a guy you designed runs for. He was never a guy who was going to produce a lot of rushing yards for you, but he was a guy who could always buy himself some time by, either breaking left or breaking right. And he was so good at throwing on the run. And coming off that injury, and also at 40 years of age, and I think his mobility was declining even before the injury. It's going to be tougher for him to do that, which means keeping him upright, avoiding pressure, blocking well. Those things take on an even bigger premium for Rodgers this year. And I think the upgrades to the offensive line at least give the Jets a fighting chance on the offensive side of the ball. But beyond blocking, you need guys who can make plays. And I during the Locked On Jets podcast, the Jets made one big addition on offense at the skill positions this offseason. But it's one that could potentially change the entire group. And we'll talk about what that is and what it means continuing here on this Monday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. PrizePicks is America's #1 daily fantasy sports app with over 5 million active members. PrizePicks is the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Unlike other apps, on PrizePicks, it's just you against the numbers. All you do is pick more or less than on 2 to 6 player stat projections, and you watch the winnings roll in. And you can now win up to 100 times your money on PrizePicks with as little as 4 correct picks. PrizePicks puts their members first, so all withdrawals are fast, safe, and secure. When your picks hit, you can get your money in as quick as 15 minutes. And PrizePicks invented the flex play, which means you can still cash out even if your lineup isn't perfect. You can double your money even if one of your picks doesn't hit. Download the PrizePicks app today and use code LOCKEDONNFL and get $50 instantly when you play $5. That's code LOCKEDONNFL. It's one word with no space, LOCKEDONNFL on PrizePicks to get $50 instantly when you play $5. You don't even need to receive the You don't even need to win to receive the $50 bonus. It's guaranteed. PrizePicks, run your game. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Monday. We're talking about what's different between the 2024 Jets and the 2023 Jets. And we've talked about how hopefully this year the Jets will have better injury luck. There's a pretty good bet that's going to happen. We talked about the Jets building an offensive line that on paper looks a lot more formidable than the one they had a year ago. I think the skill position group's also upgraded. And really, I think this comes down to one move. It's Mike Williams. Because with Mike Williams, it feels like everybody in that skill group is slotted where they should be. You've got your #1 back, Breece Hall, who's excellent. You've got your #1 receiver, Garrett Wilson, who's excellent. What was lacking was that #2 receiver last year. So you had to have Allen Lazard play that role. And I got to be honest with you, I've never been a Lazard guy. I was very critical of the signing, and I think rightly so. I think his play justified. If anything, I was too kind on the signing, to be honest, looking back. And I was not a huge fan of that particular signing. But I don't think he's as bad as he looked last year. That said, he's not a quality #2 option in the passing game. And with Mike Williams around, first of all, you have a guy who is a player of that level. Through his career, he historically has produced at the level you'd like your #2 receiver to be at. But now it's like everybody slides into their right role. You've got behind him, you've got a group of guys. You've got Lazard, you've got Xavier Gibson, you've got Malachi Corley. You can throw Conklin in there. And these are role players. These are guys who are not meant to be featured parts of the passing game. These are just guys who, if they happen to be open or if they're there for a check down, you throw them the ball. But they're not really going to be the driving force behind you winning or losing. They've got enough skill that you can put them on the field. You don't have any issues playing them. You don't have issues throwing the ball when their number comes up. But you don't have to design plays that go through them. I think with only Garrett Wilson, it created challenges for the Jets. First of all, it was like Garrett Wilson couldn't take a play off because, on every passing play, generally you have a #1 read. You have one guy, your primary option. Garrett Wilson kind of had to be that guy last year for the Jets. Otherwise, the play wouldn't work because they didn't have anybody else who could get open. So now it's like you put yourself in a position where, if Garrett Wilson wants to take a play off, he can still run the play through Mike Williams. The other aspect of this is that if Garrett Wilson's not open, it was difficult for the quarterback to have trust in anybody last year because nobody else could get open. So now if Garrett Wilson's not open, you can look to Mike Williams. I think Mike Williams also adds a lot of elements that Garrett Wilson has lacked in the past. Garrett Wilson's not very big. Williams is. Garrett Wilson's not really a great contested catch guy. Williams is. And I hear people say, "Oh, Garrett Wilson should add bulk." Whenever people say a guy like Garrett Wilson should bulk up, whenever it happens, it usually robs the player of his speed. Garrett Wilson's a guy with a lot of strengths, and instead of trying to fill the few weaknesses he has, I think they should just emphasize the strengths. And if you really need to fill those weaknesses, find a guy who has those skills that Garrett lacks. And that's what they did, I think, when they brought in Mike Williams. Now, of course, there's some risk with Williams. Robert Saleh late last week indicated that Williams will play the opener, but Saleh also kind of tried to downplay expectations. He didn't explicitly mention whether Williams is going to be on a pitch count or not, but he did say it's going to take a little time for Mike Williams to get back to being Mike Williams. So, I think you'll certainly see Mike Williams week 1 in red zone snaps where, there's not a lot of space. So you want to throw a guy you can throw the ball up to. And that's something Mike Williams has been quite adept at through his career. He's a good contested catch guy. So you'll see him in red zone snaps. You'll probably see him in big passing downs. The question is, how good is he going to be week 1? Is this a guy who's ready to step in and produce right off the bat, or is he going to be more of a decoy where because of his size, the defense still has to account for him when he's on the field. The question is, how much can he produce? Robert Saleh kind of hinted that, this might require some patience to start seeing Mike Williams produce as he comes back from this knee injury. But once Mike Williams is healthy, he's going to be a big deal for this offense because he just allows everybody to slide into the role that's good for them. Jets have a lot of guys who are fine as role players, but you don't want them to be one of the top two options in your passing game. And the other thing I'll say is, I think Mike Williams is clearly the biggest addition when we're talking about the skill positions, but the Jets also should be. Look, I know we're dealing with a couple of rookies. Braylon Allen's never stepped on the field, neither has Isaiah Davis, but the snaps you're getting from your number 2 running back can't help but be better than what the Jets got from Dalvin Cook last year. Dalvin Cook was one of the biggest wastes of money in the NFL last year for the contract the Jets gave him versus how he produced. It ended up being an awful signing. So the Jets are also probably going to get better caliber snaps out of the number 2 running backs, although Mike Williams is really the guy I have my eye on. But that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Labor Day, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.